Procurement notices, funding and grants opportunities, lists of potential partners, insights into market trends, databases of development professionals, webinars, latest news, and much more. Stay informed and connected. Visit developmentaid.org today and see how we can help you achieve your sustainable development goals together.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Development Aid Dialogues. I'm your host, Hisham Alam. Today, we will delve into one of the most significant global shifts in the aid and development sector, triggered by the recent policies of the United States under President Donald Trump's administration, with the U.S. being the largest donor of foreign aid globally. These sudden decisions, such as suspending aid programs, slashing funding for global health initiatives, and withdrawing from World Health Organization, have far-reaching consequences. The impacts are being felt not only by vulnerable communities in the global south, but also by the aid sector itself, which now faces daunting challenges to continue its work. To explore this topic, I'm joined by Matthew Robinson, Director of the Euro Gulf Information Center and a seasoned expert in foreign policy, development, and humanitarian advocacy. Matthew's extensive experience includes advising policymakers in Europe and working with organizations like Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. Today's conversation will focus on the human and developmental implications of this aid reduction, steering clear of the political debates to better understand their practical effect on the ground and the strategies required to adopt. Now, let's dive in. Hello, Matthew. We are delighted to have you here.
A pleasure to join you. Thank you so much for having me.
Matthew, let's start with a broad perspective. What is happening here? These aid cuts and suspensions have sent shockwaves through the sector. Can you give us an overview of what's behind these decisions and what makes them so significant?
Well, I think first and foremost, elections have consequences. And throughout the course of Donald Trump's presidential campaign, he made no secret with some of his proposals and plans for his four-year term that's just begun in the White House. And I think what goes to the crux of it is a debate that's going on right now within his own party, within the Republican Party, on American interventionism and American foreign policy. And I think back to former President Thomas Jefferson, when he once opined peace, commerce, and honest friendship with all nations and entangling alliances with none. And I think to an extent, you're starting to see a hark back to quasi-isolationism amongst some camps of the Republican Party, and that has been projected in the Trump White House. But whether it's withdrawal from the Paris Agreement or the WHO or even what we've seen a freeze in U.S. aid funding, none of this was hidden from the American people. It was clearly articulated in the course of his presidential campaign. So this is a consequence of elections, of Trump's America First policies. And I think they reflect an emphasis on reducing U.S. spending abroad and reassessing the effectiveness and possible realignment of foreign assistance programs with U.S. national interest at its core.
So do you think it's a burden on the American administration, or was just a shift in the foreign policy? Because losing a very important bureau in the soft power is not that easy.
Yeah, of course there is a huge, in the short term, there's a huge institutional burden for civil servants and any current lack of immediate political direction in terms of what the next, forget about even what the next year is going to look like, but the next 6 months are going to look like. I would say this is not without precedent internationally. You saw from a European standpoint, albeit in a far less dramatic setting, you saw the United Kingdom's approach as it related to international development dramatically reshaped when the Department for International Development was folded into the Foreign Commonwealth Office, now known as the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office. And at the time, then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, who was somewhat of an international ally of Trump during Trump's first term in office, was candid in the rationale for that was to look at a reshaping of British international development and humanitarian aid priorities with UK foreign policy goals. And I think you're seeing that as well with the current Trump 2 administration. But there's also a degree of urgency here. From day one, President Trump is a lame duck. He's term limited. And that is, I think, why also you've seen a rush to as many executive actions as he has right now on a host of these freezes and suspension of membership. This is a president in a hurry and with a realization that time is against him. And there's only so much a president can do by virtue of executive action, but he does enjoy congressional support both in the House and the Senate. And it will certainly be a test of his support and commanding authority over the Republican Party as a whole.
So do you think he may change his mind later?
He's already speculated on. This is the nature of the beast with Trump is that I think it was just yesterday he said there was a possibility that the US could re-enter into the WHO. So yes, I think with Trump, everything is always on the table. I would say as it relates to US aid, the direction, whether it's from Secretary of State Marco Rubio or senior officials in the White House, they've been quite blunt in there that they've been insistent that Trump's executive actions are honored and any civil servants or officials that work in a contradictory fashion to that direction will be sanctioned. But of course, I think all of these things are on the table. I think there is a possibility you could see a U.S. re-entry of the WHO. But the concern remains the U.S. is by far the biggest contributor. That for the 2-year period, 22-23, the U.S. accounted for nearly $1.3 billion in funding. This is a big player, and I think a concern of the United States is I think there's been an enthusiasm to see that rebalanced, whether that's by virtue of more funding from private donors or more funding through the other regional blocs like the European Union,
yes,
China, of course.
We will discuss this point in details, but now I'd like to reflect on what you have said. According to your experience, you have worked closely with the European and the global institutions. How do you see the US withdrawal from the WHO and its impact on collaboration in global health emergencies? What is the bigger picture in here?
An absence in U.S. leadership will shine a spotlight in another, whether it's other parts of the world, like the European Union, but also in the private sector. I would say the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation account for a huge slice of funding towards the WHO, a crucial, of course, an international organization, but an organization with American origins at its heart. But I do think there is an opportunity for European leadership to step in any vacuum, whether it's the top of the European Commission that's just commenced its second term under Ursula von der Leyen, whether it's Emmanuel Macron, but also growing and emerging leaders, people like Giorgia Meloni in Italy, that have growing influence on the world stage. So I definitely think in the absence of any American leadership here, depending on how long the suspension of membership will endure, there will be an absence of leadership. Sure, that's Europe redouble their efforts on the world stage. Whether that translates into monetary terms or not is yet to be seen. But if an American absence from this organization endures beyond this year, there will be huge funding questions that will have to be answered for the WHO. And I struggle to see right now how the organization could come near close to mitigating that funding gap that is absolutely huge.
The question here, what does this mean for the international preparedness in responding to future pandemics or health emergencies?
You've nearly answered your own question there. It poses huge issues. And in terms of the budgeting of the WHO and its roadmap over the next 5 years, all of it is contingent on what is its number one contributor, maintaining funding. So I think this has posed huge questions. And of course, there is a degree on, I think, whether you look at issues like that American funding has been consequential in helping whether health, you correctly referred to PEPFAR, that as it relates to HIV and AIDS funding, education programs, even anti-corruption initiatives, that have fueled transparency and better governance. All of that has come from generous American funding over the years. And I do worry that if this suspension of membership, not just membership, but of leadership on the world stage endures beyond the next 6 months, year, we'll start to see huge problems. Of course, you can try and diversify elements of funding sources, and you can try and find more creative solutions on a local level, but that can only go so far to mitigate what is a huge funding gap. I would say that this reevaluation of American approach internationally is not isolated. There's the same conversation being had on a domestic level in the United States as it relates to FEMA's disaster relief funding on a federal level. You're seeing a total, quite a dramatic total top-down reevaluation of how American money is being spent both domestically and internationally. And it's going to be incredibly challenging for the global community to adapt. And the elephant in the room is how long this actually will last for. Because Trump himself has said that he could reevaluate these decisions at any moment.
Exactly. As you have said, the suspension of the U.S. foreign assistance programs has impacted a wide range of initiatives, from health to anti-corruption. So, which areas do you believe are being hit the hardest, and what could the long-term effects be on these sectors?
Beyond the WHO, the US is by far the biggest player internationally in development funds and humanitarian assistance. In 2023 alone, I think for the US counted for about $72 billion internationally. You're talking about a huge pot of money. I would say one of the efforts in which the US has been pivotal is on HIV/AIDS access internationally, of which American money has been crucial and American leadership has been crucial. So I would,
you mean the PEPFAR program?
Yes, and I worry about in the interim how that could be affected. The strain that gaps in funding could have on local health systems is huge. Reduce access to life-saving medications as well that are so consequential to people, to vulnerable communities, especially in the developing world, suffering from HIV and AIDS. So I worry about that, but also deepening humanitarian crises internationally, especially as it relates to certain refugee resettlement programs.
Before we go to it, I'd like to ask you first about the US aid. The Trump administration had announced the suspension of US aid for 90 days. What is the rationale behind this move, and how does this delay and disturbance impact ongoing projects? I have seen posts from students who got fellowships from the US aid.
This occurred in quite a dramatic fashion. It was after the executive order was signed, there was a memo sent the over 10,000 USAID staffers domestically and internationally, effectively with an abrupt stop work directive. And any of the staff and officials that are found in contradiction to that executive order and that directive, it could face severe sanctions. I mean, this is the rationale from the White House's standpoint, is to allow for an immediate rethinking and potential reprioritization of some of this aid money. I do expect, I'd say, that it will of course commence at a certain point. The frustration is that there's no exact end date to this rethink. I know the new Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, has already been put under huge pressure as to the many questions that are already being framed. I would say that the difference between this time around and his first term is when Trump sought action, these many freezes and spending the first time around, there was a great uproar and pushback, both from the private sector and politically. I think because so much of this is baked in now and expected from the Trump administration. I mean, you just got to look at even the tech sector. In the Trump one, when many of these freezes occurred as it related to certain aid spending or WHO or Paris, there was outrage and damning critique of the Trump White House from many of the tech giants. This time around, there's a deafening silence. The president is in an incredibly commanding position, and a lot don't dare to question his authority. And there is whether many like it or not, he has a democratic mandate to action these things. He's done so legally by virtue of executive action, while somewhat unorthodox by just the degree at which he's done it. It's still a legal course of action. So it's all that remains now are the political calculations that have to be made by not just the White House, but obviously the State Department under the leadership of Secretary Rubio.
Matthew, in this podcast, I used to avoid talking about politics and to focus only on the humanitarian impact of the topics of the discussion. But this topic specifically leads us every time to speak about politics.
And I think it's unavoidable as it relates to the actions on the part of the Trump White House are highly political, and it's unavoidable. So, the consequence, these actions are the consequence of the modern political reality in the United States that has led the U.S. government to this point. And I just think it's a reality at this point where the United States has landed internationally, in stark contrast to the last 4 years under the Biden White House.
Yeah, I totally agree. The point you have referred to about the refugee resettlement program is another area hit hard by these cuts.
Yeah.
Families who were ready to rebuild their lives are now left in limbo. How do these disruptions deepen humanitarian crisis, and what alternative do these families have?
Yeah, this is probably one of the toughest aspects of the new Trump administration's approach to refugee and asylum policy, where there's mass deportations that are already being actioned, or a quasi-suspension to some of its own, the US's historically generous asylum and refugee policies. There's a huge question as to where is that going to leave even the current tens and hundreds of thousands of ongoing applicants, but also the many undocumented individuals. I would say now there's been an executive order to prohibit the use of the term undocumented as it relates to talking about illegal migrants. The direction out from the White House is to refer to these individuals as legal aliens, and they've been quite tough on that. But I mean, you've seen an example with the 2 U.S. military aircraft sent to Colombia full of deported illegal migrants, some of which were failed asylum applicants. And the action of the Colombian government to dare even challenge that was met abruptly with threat of trade sanctions, huge tariff threats, and the Colombian government, I think, backed down within a period of about 12 hours. So this is a complete rethink and a totally new approach as it relates to American diplomacy in terms of trying to get its head around just how it's going to even begin to deport what is, I think, in conservative estimates, about 10 million people over the next couple of years, and what that will mean for relations for those countries in which the U.S. is seeking to deport these migrants back.
There is a growing concern from organizations like Oxfam about the life or death consequences that these funding cuts could have. How do you see the role of international NGOs and civil society organizations shifting in response to this reduction in US aid?
What's going to put huge pressure on the voluntary sector? It is worth making the point that as it relates to funding, just WHO funding alone, there are big voluntary organizations like the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation that are the number 3 donor to the WHO and funds. But this will put huge pressure on a lot of, not just some of the large organizations like Oxfam, but also on the ground, a lot of local groups that are tasked with implementing and delivering a lot of this. It'll force the private sector to adapt and try and take on a more prominent role, put pressure on companies, especially social enterprises, to fill the gap and reimagine some of its own corporate social responsibility strategies. It can manifest in a host of ways, whether through new private sector partnerships, where you see more and more businesses partner with some of these existing NGOs and local government. You could see arguably increased corporate social responsibility, where more companies use some of their philanthropic arms to direct projects. And obviously, as it relates to social enterprises, I think you'll see it'll also offer an opportunity for a growing interest and impact and investment means for social enterprises, and they could play a role in whether it's addressing certain poverty goals, education, healthcare. It will obviously provide opportunities for some of these organizations, but it will not come without its challenges.
I don't like to be pessimistic, and also I don't like to underestimate the power of the NGOs and civil society, but do you think they can cover the gap that the US aid used to cover? We all know that there are local communities in the Global South that are relying heavily on these initiatives.
Yeah. In the short term, yes, I think, but in the medium to long term, absolutely not. I mean, if this fund gap continues beyond the short term, there is only going to be so much that the private and voluntary sector can do to make up this gap. I'm somewhat optimistic that, and I think you've just got to look at the president's, that US funding will be revisited and readdressed. This is not an indefinite suspension on US funding, whether it's WHO related or USAID related. This is, and how it's been articulated by the White House, is a momentary pause for a rethink and a reprioritization of some of these funds. So I am cautiously, I'd say, optimistic that within the course of the coming months, maybe even the coming weeks, that you will, and probably kind of drip by drip,
you are optimistic.
Approach that some of this money
Try to convince me why you are optimistic.
Well, I think you just got to look at the statements from the president. He's made it quite clear that he has an open mind for some of this funding to restart, probably with conditions attached. So there's going to be a diplomatic game that's going to be played here, and there's going to be certain asks from the White House and the U.S. government.
In his first term, he withdrew from climate agreement, and in the second term, he initiated it with another one. So I don't think it's the president that changes his mind for something.
Well, I think he's shown whether, just take the WHO, for example, I think he's made it quite clear that he remains open-minded to recommitting U.S. funding with the right conditions and the right commitments institutionally to reforms. That I'm cautiously optimistic that whether it's the WHO or other bodies internationally, and I think a lot of other UN bodies internationally will be watching this with keen interest, that they demonstrate enthusiasm to meet some of these asks from the US government so the funding taps can be recommitted. I don't think there'll be a reevaluation as it relates to the US government's position on the Paris Agreement. That I agree with you. I think that is very much off the table for the course of this administration. Certainly some of the president's commitments domestically to energy production. You could even look at some of the more bold proposals in Alaska as it relates to drilling efforts. So of course, I don't think Paris will be revisited. But US aid funding and even WHO funding, I don't think we should be overly too pessimistic, but I think we should watch this space.
Actually, I enjoy playing the role of devil's advocate, so I was trying to get a clear vision out of you.
Yeah. Hopefully you got some of
the critics argue that the freezing of foreign aid doesn't align with American values, as some programs have proven to be vital for people in crisis. How do you respond to this criticism, especially in terms of moral responsibility of donor countries?
I think you're right to raise that, and this is why I mentioned from the outset, I think looking at this with a wider lens, part of this is a total rethink as it relates to US foreign policy as a whole. What we've seen over the last 80 years is a United States that's embraced a role as a global leader, certainly a commitment to interventionism. And I think if you could even call it the Trump doctrine yet, but certainly the Trump administration's view of the world is a hark back to some early forms of American isolationism. And I don't think yet that even the Trump White House is confident as to how the next year will progress as it relates to some of these freezes. But I think there is a commitment to reprioritizing some more regional and national commitments, but domestically in the US, but also to its immediate neighbors in the Americas. And that will have an effect internationally. As
we have seen the balance of international relations from the European perspective. How do you think these US policy shifts might influence Europe's stance on foreign aid and its own role in global development efforts, especially after we have witnessed what the UK and Netherlands has followed the same steps? So it looks like a trend.
Yeah, as I said before, an absence of American leadership will offer an opportunity especially for blocs like the European Union to step up. I would say that from a funding standpoint, there is a limit in the reach that the Europeans have in terms of stepping up some of its funding for these bodies. It's already established a lot of its 5 to 10 year funding objectives for these organizations. So while I think there's an opportunity for increased European leadership, whether that translates into more money, I don't think that is going to materialize. And I'm skeptical that you'll see much, if not more, any more European money to try and mitigate the gap in US funds. I would say beyond even development funding, the US has demanded bigger asks across the board. You just got to look at even what President Trump has asked of Europeans on NATO, asking for a 5% target, if not 5% from all of its NATO partners. So the Americans are asking more of the Europeans across the board. And I'm not that confident that, especially considering the current absence in leadership on a regional level, whether Europe is going to be able to step up to the occasion.
How do you think that the U.S. decision to withdraw from the Paris Climate Agreement would affect the global development agenda?
As it relates to Paris, many have been anticipating this move with the Trump win. But I do think my concern is this stop-start approach to U.S. engagement on these goals is not healthy for the Paris Agreement as a whole, and will have an impact. I mean, you've just got to look to what was discussed in the most recent gathering in COP. And there was, I'd say, an aura and a sense of pessimism in the air. Of course, there were certain loose additional commitments as it relates to some global, some financing for some of the developing world and those at the front line of the climate disaster, and especially island nations that are under huge strain. But yeah, American gap of the absence of American leadership in Paris will be huge. In fact, I read some remarks for the former US climate envoy John Kerry, who was in Davos at the World Economic Forum just a matter of days ago, and his assessment of the situation was quite stark and quite damning. So it's difficult to be, I don't see how you can be anything but pessimistic. The Trump vision, it runs completely in contrast to the very ethos and heart of the Paris Agreement. There's just no other way to break that down.
Thank you, Matthew, for your valuable insights into the current state of U.S. foreign aid and its implications for the global development sector. It's clear that the effects of these policy changes will be felt for years to come, and the need for strategic cooperative responses has never been more pressing. And I really enjoyed this discussion. To our listeners, thank you for tuning into this episode of Development Aid Dialogues. Stay informed, stay engaged. Until next time, I'm Hisham Alam signing off.